If our local city government disappeared tomorrow, we would feel it pretty quickly. Garbage, transit, emergency services are all things that you and I depend on each and every day that are handled by our municipalities. As taxpayers, we expect value for our dollars. But not every city always measures up. This past winter, we saw Toronto struggle with clearing its snow after a series of winter storms, something that we all kind of expect a Canadian city should be able to handle. On this episode of the In Camera Podcast, we're going to go behind the scenes of Toronto City Hall. I'm excited to host Brad Bradford, the Toronto City Councillor for Ward 19, Beaches, East York. Brad was first elected in 2018 and re-elected in 2022, and he provides a more center-right approach to municipal government. He wants to bring a more dynamic and pragmatic approach to city governance. His background in urban planning has put himself on the front lines of Toronto's housing crisis. As part of the Planning and Housing Committee, he has spearheaded initiatives to streamline approval processes, better support the creation of diverse housing solutions, such as modular housing, and has worked hard to increase the density on their major streets. Brad's commitment to better service extends beyond housing. He's a passionate advocate for safer streets, improved transit, and supporting small businesses. Now, in many ways, Toronto and Mississauga are very different cities. Yet, there's a lot to understand about Mississauga's big city neighbor. They've had a 100-year head start on building transit. They've intensified, and they've also struggled throughout that growth. Now, as we continue to grow, we can look to Toronto and their leaders and learn from their triumphs as well as their mistakes. Brad has been a vocal advocate for improving how municipal government functions and strongly believes that we can do it better than we currently are. And now, our conversation with Brad. Everyone, welcome to the In Camera Podcast with Councillor Alvin Tedjo, where we take you behind the scenes of the political world at City Hall, Mississauga, Queen's Park, and around. Today, I'm on location in Toronto City Hall with Councillor Brad Bradford from Beaches, East York. Councillor Bradford has been an urban planner here with the City of Toronto. Has been on council for the last 2 terms. Has a wife and 2 kids in Beaches, East York. And we're in your office, so thank you for letting us come here and joining us today.
Great to have you east of the 427 and stamp your passport here in Toronto, and it's great to see you.
Well, I try not to make a habit of leaving my city too often, but thought this was an important conversation from, between the two of us, and we've had some interesting chats in and around the city space whenever we see each other at AMO or any other city type of organizations. And I think there's a lot that we can talk about here that's interesting, but I kind of wanted to start with your story because, I said you were a city planner, so you were on the, bureaucratic civil service side. What was the impetus that made you want to jump to the political side? Because, it's kind of a safe job. We employ lots of planners in municipalities. You could kind of stay there for a while. But, people like Jennifer Keesmaat, yourself, you've made this jump to the political side. Why was that?
I think in a word, it would be impact. And it's not to say that you can't create impact through the bureaucracy or the civil service. But, the truth is I was not political. I had never seen politics up close. Before I took the job in the chief planner's office at the City of Toronto, I had worked in the private sector, really working on transit projects kind of across the country. I was down in Boston, Massachusetts, working at a renewable energy not-for-profit. And then I came back to City Hall. I came back to Toronto and landed in the chief planner's office. And that was my first exposure to local government. Mm-hmm. That was my first exposure to local politics. It was my first time seeing the bureaucracy up close. And, it left me like it leaves a lot of people frustrated. So you try and be a change agent within it, and you quickly realize that the most powerful force at City Hall here in Toronto is the status quo. There is a deeply embedded culture of fear. There is a real reluctance to drive any sort of change. You don't want to make any waves. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people here that have gotten by and, in fact, moved their way up by keeping their head down.
Right.
And whether we're talking about, housing issues as, sort of in that millennial cohort and not seeing enough action on that, or the congestion that makes it impossible to get to the office or the job site or home to your family. The Hunger Games that we all go through anytime we try and register for a Parks and Rec program. All of these things left me a little bit dissatisfied. And simultaneously, I was involved with an organization called Civic Action, which you'd be familiar with out in Mississauga as well, sort of a young leaders mentorship program. And every month I would show up, and my 25 fellows in the fellowship were doing really amazing things. They were, they built an app to connect seniors with services. Somebody had started a food bank. Right. And I would show up as, middle management with no direct reports, such a bureaucratic thing, at the City of Toronto, and just sort of voice my frustration. And there was never a moment like, hey, like run for council. It was more of a gradual airing of grievances amongst friends, and kind of that classic stop complaining about it, put your hand up, try and do something, run for council. And so that was my move in 2018 after being here for 3 years. And we can talk about elections if we go there, but needless to say, really not knowing anything about politics, I probably, if I knew today what I knew then, I would have realized what a long shot it was. But through hard work and a bunch of great folks around me, we were able to overcome the odds. And on election night, there was 37,000 votes cast, and we won by 286. So, go out and vote.
Let's get into the elections. Absolutely, go out and vote. But I remember following your campaign because I had run in the 2018 provincial election, and the 2018 municipal election was just a few months after. And a lot of my colleagues who had ran in the provincial election ran municipally, some in Mississauga, some in other communities, especially here in Toronto as well. Some former MPPs. But I remember talking to a few people who were actually on your campaign. And I'm not sure, did you run against an incumbent?
I ran against a former NDP member of parliament.
Okay.
So it was like a pseudo incumbent.
Yeah.
Just had all the lists, had all the sign locations, had the unions, had the fundraising, had the volunteers. So a lot of the things that come with incumbency, and principally name rec, this guy had.
But I remember people talking about your campaign as being, really youthful, really exciting, really forward-looking towards the city. And I think you got people excited. And yes, absolutely, you need to vote, especially with a margin of only 200 plus votes. And so how have you found the transition since then?
Well, the first thing I had to do was sort of, kick off the rust or the bad habits of being a bureaucrat. And I say that with all love to my friends in the civil service, but you realize you're there to represent the people that elected you. You're not there to make excuses for why things are the way they are, which is really the bureaucratic mentality. Like, well, we'd like to be further along, but A, B, and C, or we can't do that because of X, Y, and Z. Like, I find with all the different challenges facing people right now, they don't have a lot of patience or a lot of tolerance for that. But that is the sort of default position for a lot of folks, a lot of the bureaucrats here in this building. So I was wired that way, and I had to sort of get rid of that. And that took a little bit of time. But also just, the impression I had of different councillors was different as a civil servant versus once you get to know them. It's like any workplace. Yeah. You build relationships. You find out, who's great to collaborate. You find out who might not necessarily be someone that you want to work with on every file. And you pick your moments. What I really like about the job, what I like about local government, is this is the level of government that is closest to people. And what's interesting is you talk to people about politics, first thing that comes to mind, of course, is federal. They're thinking about the big show, prime minister, all that sort of stuff. Next would be provincial. And yet, if you talk to them about the issues, if you talk to them about gridlock, if you talk to them about housing, if you talk to them about their parks, if you talk to them about transit actually showing up on time, very quickly, it's like, well, these are all city issues.
Yeah.
So you can always talk to people about the issues, even if local government or city hall is not necessarily their first point of reference when you're talking about government or politics. But you can always have a conversation with people about the issues. And when you roll up your sleeves as a elected official at a local government level, and certainly I've seen this from you out of Mississauga on the housing file, you can actually really move the needle in a profound way. These are not private members' bills that get tabled and go off to die. Yeah. This is real change with respect to our policies and our bylaws that immediately can take the city in a different direction.
I always tell people the local level of municipal politics is the one that affects you the most on a day-to-day level. you would notice if the city, the municipality, stopped picking up the garbage, enforcing the laws.
Ask David Miller.
Yeah.
People would notice if we stopped picking up the garbage. You know?
Excuse me. And it has a profound effect on people's day-to-day quality of life. But, if the federal government disappeared tomorrow, how quickly would you notice? Maybe right now,
Maybe
you would,
today, yeah.
with all the trade issues. So maybe walk through your first couple of years. What are some of the motions or legislation that you've put in here in Toronto that you've really been proud of?
Well, one thing I'd reference is the different communities that make cities like Toronto and Mississauga so distinct, so culturally diverse. And, the declaration of Bengletown on Danforth, I think, is really paying recognition and homage to the thousands of Bengali Canadians who have built businesses, raised families, brought their time and their talent and their investment to do something special out in the East End. And for them, like a lot of new Canadian communities, they wanted that to be recognized by government, recognized by the city. And so, we renamed a section of Danforth Bengletown to recognize the fact that 90% of the businesses there are Bangladeshi. And it's not first generation, it's first, second, third generation. Yeah. They've been city builders in a really, not in a way that like podcasts would talk about, but in a nuts and bolts, like they are, reuniting families. They are building housing. They are entrepreneurs. They are building businesses. And so seeing how much that meant to that community was really profound and moving. And it was also something that they had been working on for many years. But, like a lot of groups, there are different leaders and different views and different perspectives and not necessarily everyone rowing in the same direction. So to be a small part of bringing folks together, is something I'll never forget. And it's a lasting impact. On the policy side, as a, I don't know if you'd call me a reformed urban planner, but certainly Toronto has been the city that's said no. We've made a career out of saying no in this building, and that has come at the expense of units of housing. It has come at the expense of status quo. It has come at the expense of pricing people out of this market and pushing folks in a flight for affordability into the GTHA, interprovincial migration out to Alberta, folks moving south of the border. And so the way I think about it, despite the historic headwinds we're facing right now with inflation and interest and construction and labor challenges, right now we're setting the table for growth on a go-forward basis that will look a lot different than our 2003 official plan articulated, which was really when we amalgamated and we set the table for, look, there's going to be growth at the centers and growth along the avenues. We can talk about why that's never materialized. But we're going to leave the neighborhoods alone. No growth in the neighborhoods. Well, Toronto is 640 square kilometers. So you start taking out huge chunks of neighborhoods and saying this is off limits for anything but a single detached house, coupled with immigration, coupled with a city that for a long time people wanted to be in. You see the escalation on pricing and housing and all the supply issues. So last term, for a period of time, I was the chair of the Planning and Housing Committee. I was able to pen what we called the Housing Action Plan, 52 recommendations to address some of the policy, design guidelines, official plan policies and bylaws that had really been standing in the way of the type of gentle density that ultimately will unlock more housing for more people in more neighborhoods. And we can go through what that looks like. But effectively, I feel like when I walk out of this building, we will have rewritten some of those policies that were very exclusionary and ultimately set the table for a city that's ready to grow in a more inclusive and sustainable way.
I mean, I want to talk about opposition to that a little bit because, in Mississauga, one of our biggest challenges, we were talking about, as of right, 3 units. We were talking about 4plexes, ARUs, which is essentially the accessory units. I know you know this. I'm just sort of saying this for everybody else. That people didn't see it as gentle, and they saw it as something that was going to happen immediately, take over their communities, change the fabric of their communities. And ultimately, we pushed through. We did get it done. We are just allowing large single-family home lots to sort of split up as well, but not without resistance. And you would think that a place like Toronto, with as much density as you have, you wouldn't have as much resistance. But I'm guessing there's been some.
Yeah, there's been some, and you look at the avenues policy that sort of limped across the finish line through council relatively recently, and I think that reflects some of that resistance. What I would say about that is change is hard. It's hard. As humans, everybody change is difficult, and so I understand the inclination to keep doing the same thing over, and yet people will talk to you about the challenges of their kids getting into the housing market. Yeah. Entrepreneurs who want to locate and invest in this region, in this city, in your city, they will talk about the challenges from a housing affordability and a housing supply side. Seniors who are looking to downsize will decry the fact that there's no opportunities to stay in the neighborhood where they live. So it becomes real for people when you start going through the issue set. You just have the classic sort of response of like, well, we need more options, but just don't put it here. I think we've sort of moved off that a little bit. Now the arguments against are more sophisticated, or at least a little bit more nuanced, where it's like, well, we'd like to see some affordable housing, but this is not enough affordable housing. So I have to say no to the project because it's only 20% affordable and not 50% affordable. Meanwhile, ignoring the fact that if you commandeered 50% affordable units, subsidized units on a project, the project would be not financially viable and it would be dead on arrival. And I always say to my colleagues, well, what's 50% of zero? It's zero. So 0 units. But that's been a way, particularly the left wing of council has inserted these poison pills into some of our housing now is raised the bar so high when it comes to subsidy and affordability that the projects are effectively not viable right from the get-go. I think when you manage change, you can lead from the front or you can lead from the back. I've chosen to lead from the front and have those difficult conversations with people. Talk about what the issue that we're trying to address and then, hear their perspectives. And I think politicians err when they are too self-righteous about these sorts of things, when they can't have empathy to understand where somebody's coming from, understand what their concerns are, and then do the hard work to actually figure out how to address them. Yeah. It's very easy to take a perch of moral superiority to talk down to people, but I've never won an argument by telling someone how stupid they are. And, I think it is actually important in this civic arena to really engage in those conversations, hear people out, and work together to figure out how you can address those concerns, recognizing you can't address all of them, and recognizing that it's going to be different than what we have today. But we would agree what we have today is not necessarily desirable.
Yeah, you have to have a pragmatic approach to it. You have to understand the point of view, just the people looking for housing, but also the people trying to build the housing. Right. And the people trying to manage the housing system. And, as much as we want to believe that people are going to do this out of the goodness of their own heart, they need to make a profit margin. They need to fit certain timelines. They have challenges in terms of financing. There's a lot of challenges in terms of housing. You mentioned here in Toronto, I'm not sure if it's unique, so I kind of want to ask you a bit more about it because you're the largest council in the country. Well, in terms of how many people you represent, but you've got 25 councillors and the mayor. Mm-hmm. I know Montreal has 100 councillors, which is kind of wild to me to think about.
Seems like a lot.
Yeah, seems like a lot. Probably too many. There's probably a balance in between. But I guess, are there more of these political or left-right coalitions that have formed? Because, in Mississauga, we have former Conservative MPs, former Liberal MPs, MPPs. We kind of know where each other falls on the spectrum, but we don't often vote that way. It's more of a, coalition of the willing per issue, and people have a pretty independent streak in terms of, this is what I believe in, whether or not that's what the party I used to belong to believes in.
Yeah.
How different is that here in Toronto, and especially given that you have a further left-wing sort of coalition than you would see outside of the city?
Yeah, I think like the City of Toronto Council is the epicenter of left-wing politics in the country. And so like there's a lot of that here. But you're right. It's the coalition of the willing. It's the level of government where pragmatism is really required to rise to the top. And I think we're best when we're practical. I think we're at our worst when we're ideological. And that's probably true for local governments kind of across the board, because this is the get shit done level of government. And as you said, if you're not getting it done, it is acutely visible to people. So at the end of the day, we have to have solutions to the problems and the challenges and deliver the services that people are relying on. It's interesting when you talk about party politics. I am increasingly of the view that at Toronto, we should probably just make an effort to be more transparent and formalize that. People will talk about how there's no political parties at City Hall, but that would be for folks who are only just checking in during election time.
Right.
If you're here on the day-to-day basis, the sort of left-wing element of council, the NDP, they have been caucusing for years. They caucused in the previous administration. They obviously now form the government now under Mayor Chow. So there is an NDP coalition, and that is augmented by Progress Toronto, which, I wouldn't expect necessarily the listeners to know what that is, but it's effectively a left-wing political party that engages in third-party campaigns and, mobilizes in elections and in between elections to drive discourse, to spread their particular take on an issue, to build lists, to gather data. And to their credit, they've been very, very effective. But that's only been, a voice for 30% of people in Toronto. And I look at jurisdictions like Vancouver, where they have political parties, and
it's more transparent.
It's exactly let's just call it what it is. Councillors are elected at large, which I think is an interesting idea. I think the provincial government in Alberta has just moved towards a political party system municipally. Certainly they do that in Montreal. So I think we in Toronto have kind of the worst of both worlds in that we say that there are no political parties or organizations.
But you operate like there are.
But we have one.
Right.
And so that's actually kind of the worst of all worlds. And I'm increasingly just of the view, call it what it is. And, for those of us who are interested in more practical, common sense government, get organizing, put it together. But I think it would be better for Torontonians, if the local government was just honest about what's happening. And so then when you get to that ballot booth and on a local council race, there's 16 people on the ballot, or a mayoral race and there's 102 people on the ballot. Those,
we only had 20, so it wasn't as bad as yours.
Though, but it sends a signal of okay, I don't necessarily know Brad, but I know that this particular group is about an affordable city and a safe city and a safe city where people can get around, and those are the principles. And if I'm voting on that ticket, that's what I can anticipate as my elected representative.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're not talking about partisan as in liberal conservative.
No.
Okay. We're talking about coalitions.
Right.
Yeah. And I think in some provinces, they allow municipalities to choose whether or not they want to follow a system like that. I don't think they really allow that at all in Ontario, but it would be an interesting way to be more transparent about that.
Yeah, and it might not be right. I think your point about let a municipality decide if they want to go in that direction, it might not be right in every jurisdiction.
Right.
But I can just tell you here, that's how it operates, but only with the NDP. And so, and credit to them fully. I just think we should call that for what it is, and the rest of us should do a better job organizing around our values and make sure that we're communicating that with residents.
So you ran in the mayoral election after getting reelected in 2022.
Along with a lot of friends.
How many? 102
on the ballot.
How many of those were either councillor or previous politicians? It was 9 or 10?
Yeah. So you had 3 of us from council, former councillor, former police chief, different pundits in the media space. Yeah, so a lot of folks in former MPPs, former ministers, everybody.
Certainly interests a lot of people because nobody wants to try to take down an incumbent. So,
well, and I think it was the biggest municipal by-election in the history of the country.
Yeah, and more people directly vote in that election for whoever wins than in any other election we have in the country, right? Because
that's right.
Always electing parliaments.
When you run for prime minister, you're still just getting elected by the people in Papineau or wherever you are, right? And so, but the city of Toronto, it's 25 federal ridings. So it's interesting. It's like running a campaign for gas in 25 federal ridings at the same time.
Yeah, you'd be larger than half the provinces.
Yeah. I mean, Toronto's population now is like 3 million people, roughly. So that's a lot of folks.
That's a lot of folks. So, since the election, since this new administration has started under Mayor Chow, how's it going? I see you on TV a lot.
Sure.
I hear you on the radio. And, given that there's this, I guess, NDP government here in Toronto, have you, or are you and your colleagues, is there, kind of an opposition coalition, or is this something that you're sort of taking upon yourself?
Well, let's talk about the good things first.
Yeah.
So, Mayor Chow demonstrated that she was able to sort of carry through some of the work that was underway with the previous administration in terms of uploading the Gardner, in terms of the quote, new deal for Toronto.
We're still waiting on our new deal.
Yeah, get in line. But now they've got a new mandate, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure the province will be ready to hammer that out for Mississauga, and I hope they do. But yeah, I mean, like, that work had been underway with the previous administration. She was able to carry that through, and uploading the Gardner. We were the only municipal jurisdiction in the province that was effectively paying for 400 series highways, and we had 2 of them.
Yeah.
It was quite a position reversal because Mayor Chow had actually campaigned on tearing down the Gardner. The irony is she is now the mayor that will ensure it's there for the next 100 years. But it was okay because I agreed with that. Like, I'm sure you had a challenge getting into the city today from Mississauga, and that is a hellish experience.
So I have a beef with you because we took that Gardner and it was like 2 lanes.
Yeah.
Couldn't get off onto Lake Shore.
Right. Yeah. So we could talk about traffic management, and that is not something where I'd score high points. I also think that, she's got a lot of energy and she is out in the community on a regular basis. I think that's important as the mayor. Again, you're the mayor for everybody who calls Toronto home and would like to. And so I see her out at a lot of events because I'm out there too. And certainly she keeps a packed calendar, and you're going to see her at the Grilled Cheese Festival or something, and you're going to have a great interaction. So I think she does, she works hard, and she's across the city all the time. And I think that's important. Some of the other challenges, though, I would say has been a lack of prioritization on the services that people would expect local government to deliver. I think sometimes Mayor Chow gets distracted, will pick unnecessary fights, whether that is with the police or whether that is with rideshare companies or with our downtown airport. These are battles where she has expended significant political capital before ultimately acquiescing. And I just don't know if that's the best use of time in the mayor's office. And then I think it comes at the expense of some of the sort of core services that people really expect the city to deliver on, whether that is
snow removal.
Well, snow removal is particularly painful right now. Obviously, the city of Toronto did not get the job done on that. The mayor sort of disappeared for the first 11 days. We had a lot of snowfall that came over a period of a week.
Yeah.
But it wasn't historic or record-breaking in any sense. It was like 3 20-centimeter snowstorms. And, because it felt like the mayor was asleep at the switch there, she wasn't marshaling the resources. She wasn't calling in the transportation staff to triage the issues. We didn't do any snow removal. And when you've got that much snow coming in, not in one shot, but across a number of different snowstorms, you have an opportunity to remove the snow. And in a city like Toronto, you need to, because there's no place to store it. We don't have the wide boulevards or areas where you can just pile it up. You actually have to truck it out. And, to be missing in action for 11 days and then come out and blame the city staff, I didn't think was a real strong leadership position. The TTC continues to be a massive pain point for people. The hiring and the resources that we are deploying right now do nothing to improve safety. They do nothing to improve reliability. They do nothing to deal with the $140 million a year we ship out to fare evasion. So that's where I would be deploying resources and energy. And instead, we're hiring what they call information agents. I call them Walmart greeters. Okay. But basically they stand at the stations and welcome you to TTC. As a result, there's tons of service interruptions. It's more likely that you're going to experience that on the subway than not. And transit ridership continues to be down. The congestion stuff is kind of becoming the hallmark of Toronto.
Just doubled the number of, or tripled the number of people who are standing in the intersections directing traffic.
Yeah, and you know what? Like that's obviously a Band-Aid solution. It is helpful in those intersections, and I'm glad that we're doing it. But the lack of coordination from a construction standpoint, the fact that at any given time you've got King Street, Queen Street, Richmond, Adelaide, all of our east-west streets in the downtown tied up simultaneously means there's nowhere for the traffic to go. Same thing with our north-south streets. It's done in a fashion where there's no stage gating on these infrastructure projects, and these are our own projects. We need to do a better job coordinating that, and you need to have somebody in charge. I campaigned on that to have sort of like a traffic czar or a congestion czar. The Board of Trade just released recommendations effectively saying the same thing. And then you've got the mayor and the administration just sort of coming out and saying, thanks very much, we're already doing that. Well, talk to anyone who's trying to get in and out of the city. They can tell you that there's no coordination on this. So, and then I guess the last one would be affordability for somebody who campaigned on the idea of let's make Toronto more affordable. I mean, it's a 25% tax hike in 3 years, and pick your metric, whether it's TTC reliability or housing affordability or, the violent crime.
It's not better. Yeah.
So these are the challenges. So there's pluses and minuses, but I think there's a lot of people that are looking for a government that can deliver on the basics. The mayor continues to struggle with that here at Toronto City Hall.
So let's get into the budget a bit because, we struggle with this in Mississauga and in Peel, trying to find that balance. We've asked the provincial government to give us the same, powers that Toronto has to generate revenue, introduce new taxes, whatever it is. But they're also very resistant, and they're also constantly downloading new things and social services. And, one of the biggest differences we have with Toronto is hospital funding. Toronto doesn't have to provide a local share for hospitals, even though you have the best hospitals we have in the province. We have to contribute, $1.5 billion to our new hospital, and they want us to put that on the tax base.
Wow.
So, we're just trying to get parity with Toronto as, the third largest city in the province in terms of what we can and can't do and what we're expected to be able to deliver, on top of the fact that, the structure of suburbs in terms of how they're funded with property taxes is going to be a never-ending game of whack-a-mole once we finish the life of our infrastructure, right? We're never going to generate enough revenue. So then we have to constantly keep building and building new and sort of trying to intensify. But when it comes to the budget here in Toronto, obviously 25% tax increase you're saying over the last 3 years, which makes it deeply unaffordable. What are some of the solutions you've been advocating for? What do you want to see the city do? What do you want to see the province step in and do?
Yeah, this is always the question. And I feel like, with Mayor Chow and this administration, the answer is always more taxes and more fees. But folks in, Mississauga and across Ontario, maybe across the country would say, wow, like an $18.8 billion operating budget, larger than 5 provinces. Like, you're telling me you don't have enough? Mm-hmm. I think that's a reasonable question to ask. Our budget went up by $1.8 billion this year. It's $18.8 billion. So I think the idea that it's always a revenue problem, at least in the context of the city of Toronto, is not true.
Yeah.
I think if you talk to a lot of people, they would probably agree, geez, can you not get it done with $18.8 billion? And so that comes down to the choices that we make. It's interesting. I am certainly very sympathetic to the structural deficit that exists in municipalities because of, the jurisdiction and the downloading that has taken place over the years in this province by governments of all stripes, actually. Mm-hmm. We did have an NDP government one time.
Yep.
So governments of all stripes. But at the same time, the city of Toronto is putting up its hand and self-selecting the downloading. Right now we added $6 or $8 million to our budget this year to run a breakfast program in our public schools. And again, I got 2 young kids, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. We all agree.
They're really young.
Yeah. So they're not even in public school yet, but they're in daycare. I think we all agree that, kids on a full belly are going to perform better in school. But I would ask the question, and the left villainize me for this, but I would just ask the question, does it make sense on a regressive property tax base to be funding a school breakfast program in the public school system on public school property that is funded and delivered by the province.
Right.
Like, why are we putting our hands up to that? Instead, use the bully pulpit of mayor to go out and push the province. If you believe in that, push the province to put more money and resources in that program. But, I think we have to be very clear-eyed and mission-focused on the things that local governments are required to deliver and best positioned to deliver. And we need to get better value for money. And I'll give you another example. We had a really damning Auditor General report that came out towards the end of the summer that found our park staff are only in the parks 52% of the time. And so rightly, Torontonians were outraged about that because, they think about the job that they are employed at. And certainly if you were only showing up 52% of the time, you'd be fired. Now, we're not able to do that here in this environment. So these folks aren't fired. But what was our response at budget? Our response was to hire an additional 400 plus staff to work in the Parks Division and to increase that budget by $37 million. And I said to the mayor, I said, look, we don't need to add 400 people to the Parks Department. We could just actually ensure that those staff that we already have show up 100% of the time instead of 52% of the time. That'd be like doubling our complement. So these are, our response is always, more staff, more money, more revenue. And I think we need to be smarter and more strategic about how we deploy that $18.8 billion, recognizing we can't be all things to all people. And there's a role for what the local government ought to be doing. And there's also things that, frankly, we're not best positioned to or aren't really our core business. And, those are the things that we would have to say no to.
Yeah, we've been, I think, trying to shame, other orders of government when necessary into doing the right thing, right? And we did it with the federal government in terms of asylum seekers. As many asylum seekers as you had, we had at least a third of them.
Yep.
And we have far less resources to deal with that population. And so we had to do it up front, but we had to do it up front because otherwise they'd just be on the street. And then we had to send the bill to the federal government and shame them essentially into paying for it, which they did. To their credit, but they didn't foresee the problem coming.
It was like pulling teeth.
Yeah.
Same thing here, like publicly admonishing them.
Yeah.
And again, like when governments make decisions, the feds and the province, they make decisions that have direct ramifications for local governments that are effectively holding the bag. And yet we have zero line of sight or control over any of those decisions. And I'm talking about, refugees and migrant seekers, asylum seekers. We don't control any of that. And yet we're the ones that have to deal with it on the ground floor. In the city of Toronto, 40% or more of our shelter population was asylum seekers.
Yeah.
Like we have no control over that, but we're stuck with the bill. And then, we were at
70%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was wild.
But then a bad client, you're chasing them and hounding them to pay you.
Yeah.
It's bad.
So what do you think is the reasonable way for us to grow the city? I mean, it seems like economic development is a big topic right now. People are really worried about what's going to happen with the impact of tariffs. This is another thing that municipalities have so little control over, right? It's these other federal agencies, federal government, other countries. We're talking about the United States, kind of reframing how the relationship currently works. Can we use that bully pulpit with the businesses that are in Toronto, the corporations that have deep ties into the U.S.? How else can we be more effective of a vehicle to try and make sure that we're weathering the storm here?
Well, a couple things. You've got great relationships through the work that you've done, both north and south of the border. And I know you've spent some time doing some advocacy on behalf of Mississauga, but, Canadian municipalities writ large. So thank you for that. I think impressing upon those jurisdictions in the U.S. what the economic cost, in terms of dollars, in terms of tariffs, in terms of jobs, what that is going to be in those jurisdictions. Politicians can't ignore that. And so I appreciate that you've been down carrying that mission and that message forward. I think it's a shot across the bow for Canada to wake up, for municipalities to get very clear-eyed about what we need to do. Here at Toronto, we've had a bunch of performative motions from the mayor. We're not going to provide an electric vehicle grant for taxis that want to buy Teslas. Now, the first question you would ask is why are we providing grants for for-profit taxis to buy electric vehicles anyways? Yeah. But if you can get past that question, You might ask, like, all right, is it Tesla? Is it American? So is it also Ford? Is it GM? Is it Chevrolet? No, it's just Tesla. We understand why. Mr. Musk is not a particularly popular guy in this country, and I appreciate it. But I just referenced that for the performative nature.
Yeah.
We've said we're going to buy local. Okay. Like, we should generally try and buy local as Canadians anyways. We should generally try to support Canadian manufacturing, Canadian jobs. And so if you get past all the performative stuff, where do municipalities really need to be on this? Because you're right. We're not like the feds or the province where we're going to cut subsidy checks or, invest, millions or billions of dollars of subsidies to bail out different sectors. Well, the shot across the bow is we need to get serious about competition. I hear all the time about businesses that are looking abroad to different markets, whether that is, that interprovincial migration going out west where, it's a more business friendly environment. You've got lower taxes, you've got a younger workforce, you have more affordable housing. I hear about, cities in Miami, Minneapolis, Dallas, Austin that are eating Toronto's lunch, like up and coming municipalities that are hungry for our talent and for our investment and our capital, and they're taking it. So what can we do? We need to come up with a strategy that makes Toronto or Mississauga, let's talk about the region, the most attractive place to build a business in the world. And, for local governments, there's a couple ways to do that, but the biggest one is having a tax environment that is not overly punitive towards entrepreneurs and towards businesses. And number 2 and 3 are cutting the red tape and the regulation. Less bureaucratic hurdles, less roadblocks, and delivered in a more time-effective fashion so that people can get in and out of City Hall to start their business faster. You don't want local government to be the impediment.
No.
And if we're not doing that, we're kind of wasting our time.
Yeah.
And again, we have to change that mentality. How do we compete not just here in the region? We're not competing with ourselves anymore. We need to position ourselves as a destination for that capital, for that investment, and pull up our socks because other jurisdictions are on the move and they're doing those sorts of things. And we in Toronto rest on our laurels the past 20 years of investment and just assume that the prologue is going to be indicative of the future. But if we don't make change today, that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, we need to be good at what we're responsible for doing. And, one of the interesting things when we go to these meetings with other mayors and other municipalities is they talk about what the things that they're trying to do to catch up and potentially get ahead. And they're talking about AI, they're talking about processing times, they're talking about how to encourage more business. And then you look at Mississauga, Toronto, I'll call it the greater Mississauga area, and we kind of sit on our laurels of, well, this is, the number 1 destination for economic investment in the country, and the area around the airport's the number 2 in the country. And so, we know that they're just going to keep coming to us. That's not true. They're going to go to where the talent is. They're going to go to where the environment is better. And we need to find ways 100% to foster more of that moving forward. And so
every crane, we always talk in Toronto, we got so many cranes, right? Like we got the most cranes in North America. Every crane that exists right now in the skyline, when that comes down at the end of that project, it's not going back up again, right? Like that's where we are right now. And I think similarly, we're seeing major corporate businesses that are leaving the downtown core. Because why would you be here? It's impossible to get here. Your staff aren't coming into the office. They're going into bigger spaces in the GTHA. They're also looking to relocate their offices and their jurisdictions, their offices and their teams in a place where they're not necessarily going to be subjected to the sort of tariffs, however that lands. And I know it's hour to hour, minute to minute right now. But of course, business is looking for certainty. And so, Toronto relying on the fact that for 20 years this was really a great place to be, that's not a given on a go-forward basis. And unless we pull up our socks and address those 3 things, taxes, red tape, regulation, people, our own businesses are going to be looking elsewhere, let alone the idea of attracting new ones. And that is that's a recipe for death for municipalities. And you've seen that story play out in the US in decades previously. Canada was largely insulated from that. But again, like our biggest mistake will be complacency or just a strategy that's sort of a big collective group hug where we say everything's going to be okay. My goodness. I think that would be hugely irresponsible of our elected officials and our leadership. And we have to get serious about real solutions in those three veins rather than just the sort of performative stuff that makes everybody feel good.
So maybe just for the last topic we cover here before we wrap up, around that complacency and engagement with the public. It seems very obvious, as we were talking about earlier, people are, most engaged in what's happening at the federal level, a little less on the provincial level. And then, finally, we had a turnout in our last mayoral by-election of 26%, which was actually up from the 21% that we had in the last general election. How do we get more people engaged and involved at this level, understanding as well as we do how important it is to have good people at this level? Because sometimes it's just who puts their hand up. But how do we get good people? How do we get qualified people? How do we get people who understand where we need to go, have a vision for where we need to go, and are able to take that pragmatic approach to work with the people to get there?
I think for a lot of us, these positions sort of find you, and it finds you out of a position of passion, a belief in your city and a belief that we can do it better. That was certainly my story, and I know yours has been a life of service. It doesn't come without tremendous sacrifice, and I think that's the challenge of how do you get more great people involved. I think it's also the reason that the same folks around the table have, historically been here for a really long time. You don't see a lot of fresh faces, a lot of fresh perspectives, and even within the civil service, even within the bureaucracy, the authors of the problems and the challenges that we are facing today are many of the same people who are there that are supposedly going to solve them. Right. And that doesn't check out.
Yeah.
So I think you need to show people that their vote matters. I think you need to show people that there is a better vision. We need to be able to articulate that. We need to be better at articulating that and making sure folks understand what's at stake. Now, in a time of crisis, whether we're looking at the federal government, provincial government, or, our local governments, that becomes very real for people. When you are constantly getting booted off of line 2 on the TTC and kicked out of a subway station and having to jump on a bus and, you miss a meeting or you can't get home to your kids to take them to hockey practice, you're red hot about that. Oh, yeah. That's super frustrating. Yeah. When you see your property tax bill, it's gone up by $1,000 over the past 3 years, and the snow clearing's never been worse, and there's still potholes everywhere. You start to connect those dots, but you can't it's not just enough to identify the problem. We also need to be able to articulate the vision of what better would look like for people.
So how do you best engage with your residents? Because I see you out there on social media. I see you doing interviews. I find municipal government is probably the most accessible level of government for people to engage with, yet a lot of people don't. Or you get the sort of same people coming in and out of your office or on your phone all the time.
Yeah, I live at Danforth and Woodbine, so I jokingly call it, that's the Beaches 500 section, when the Beaches nosebleeds. I'm also not quite in East York because I'm a little bit further south. But part of that is just walking on the subway, going to the grocery store. You probably get this too. People are always happy to tell you where they're at and what you're doing wrong and how they can fix it. So I get a lot of good ideas from a lot of people that want me to know. But I think we need to engage in different formats than were characteristic of how we used to do it. The idea that folks have time to be in the church basement at 7:00 on a Wednesday night. Obviously, you're only talking to and listening and hearing from a very specific demo. It's not like young fathers who have young kids who are in the midst of doing homework or trying to do bath time or get people down.
I do get that at the hockey rink though with my kids. When I go to the hockey rink, they'll come and tell me.
Well, yeah, you could be at Ted Reeve Arena or wherever, 8 a.m. for House League on a Saturday morning. In fact, that happens. They're telling me the lines need to be painted at the rink because there's parking chaos because no one can see the lines and people are triple parking. And
so that's true every time I have to come into a game in Toronto.
Yeah, so you hear about it in different places, and I think it's just important to have a commitment to listening. I'll get feedback from constituents, and I just voice to text right into my office's Slack channel, and we get to work on whatever that issue is. But I think we need to be open to doing it differently. I think the fact that you have a podcast that people can tune into and talk about local municipal issues in Mississauga and abroad is brilliant. I think that's wonderful. because the idea of using traditional media, it's so diffused now, and people are so, I don't want to say distracted, but just consumed with living their day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how often I hear from people who don't even want to tune into the news anymore because it's so depressing, and it's generally bad news. And they're dealing with their day-to-day life challenges with paying their rent, paying their mortgage, putting gas in the tank and food on the table. And it's kind of never been harder than it is right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, on the street, on the subway, on social media, the traditional media, your newsletters, all the community events, like all the different ways, but there can never be too much engagement. It's always just never enough. And we have to strive to do more of it more often in different ways.
I mean, I find we try to do everything. We try to engage with people on every channel possible, wherever they are. And I still get people who often say, we never hear from you. We don't know what's going on. And I'm like, I don't know how many other ways we can try to do this, but it is what it is. How long are you going to do this for? Is this the career for you now?
Yeah, no, I certainly won't be here forever. You know what? Like, generally speaking, I'm a guy that thinks there's a shelf life in municipal politics, and there are people here in this building who have been elected longer than I've been alive.
Oh yeah,
I'm a 1986 model, so that's do the math on that.
I'm the youngest councillor in Mississauga.
Yeah, I don't know how old you are, but you look great. You got more hair than I do. I would just say, if you're not waking up every day with a burning passion to go in there and create the impact that these jobs provide for, it's probably time to look at other options. And I always tell people there's lots of different ways you can make a difference. Volunteerism is core to that. Finding something that you're passionate about, and then seeing what the avenues are for engagement. Volunteerism, again, always comes to the top of the list. But if you are an entrepreneur and you want to build something and you can find a way to monetize it, I think that's good. Politics is one way, but it's not the only way. I certainly won't be doing this forever. But I do think about how can I maximize every day that I have in the seat, in the role, because it is such a privilege. And there's a lot of work that can get done, and there's certainly a lot of work left to do.
Well, Brad, certainly, I don't think anyone can say you don't have passion for it. I think your work here over the last couple of terms has raised the bar for municipal politicians in terms of engagement, in terms of interaction, in terms of putting forward ideas and really pushing the envelope for change. And I do find that that's the hardest thing that we have here, is to go up against the status quo. So as a neighbor over in Mississauga, thank you for keep pushing the envelope. And I hope we get more chances to work together in the future.
Love that you're leading in Mississauga. Great to have you in here for a chat, and keep swinging because it looks good on you. Thanks, Alvin.
Thanks, Brad. And that's it for this episode of the In Camera Podcast. I want to thank Brad Bradford for sharing his views on how we can run big cities better, on building more homes, and his insights on politics across Toronto. You can follow Brad on X at Brad M. Bradford or on Instagram at Bradfordgrams. If you have any questions for me that you'd like me to answer on the pod, email me at alvintedjo.bsky.social. Thank you for listening.